Hi, I'm Jeremy Law. In this video I'm going to talk about some games from the Metropolitan Online Rapid Tournament number 31, which happened a couple of weeks ago for a 10+5 format between a few of the Metropolitan Chess Club members. So round one was me versus JB001, a young talented player, fairly heavy favourite. And this starts off with knight f3, d5, g3, which is a really fun flexible system. You can do the usual King's Indian attack business, or maybe play for some sort of English or Reti, or, as happens in this game, a reverse Gruenfeld with d5, or d4 in this case. Black playing quite principally, trying to control the centre. So my opponent plays bishop g4, which is a position I know a lot better from the black side when the bishop's still on f1 or f8 as it is with black, but the response I play in this game is still kind of the main line with black and works well here too. And this I think is actually quite an instructive mistake, and the first kind of point I want to talk about, because when black captures this knight and white obviously recaptures, it's quite difficult for black to finish development, and there's a lot of pressure on black's centre. Once black's made a natural move to defend that, white can carry on attacking. This is all quite uncomfortable for black. There's also this sort of latent threat of queen coming out to h5, or a4, sorry. I'm still thinking from black's point of view. And where are these pieces going to go? The only safe square is on e7, but both pieces are sort of fighting for that square. The knight doesn't really want to get taken on h6, can't go to f6, so it's surprisingly awkward for black, even though it looks like he's made pretty reasonable moves. So as played in the game, takes, and I just win that pawn outright. I'm going to assume black's move was a mouse slip or some sort of related error, because this doesn't make very much sense. And now black's a full piece down, and the rest of the game was just mopping up. But I thought that was kind of an interesting thing to point out, both in this position and for the reversed Gruenfeld position. So well played, that was round one for me. And now one of the more interesting games. This time we're playing against Adam, who is the tournament favourite and outrates me by about 100 points. And he has white. We've played a number of games against each other, and quite often we end up in the sort of position we do. It's another Gruenfeld, but different variation. This one much more symmetrical, with c4. So white, having finished development in a very similar way to black's, starting to chip away at black's centre. And this is the line I normally play, but now slightly unusual move from white here. Main move is this, but I had played this before and fancied doing something a little bit different, which is less good, it turns out, but still probably playable. Just a6, so the idea that once the queen takes this pawn on c4, we can play b5 and get our bishop to this nice diagonal, controlling e4, stopping white from occupying the full centre for at least for the moment. And my aim for probably the next 10 moves, or at least 5 moves, is going to be to try and get one of these breaks in, especially c5, to get rid of my backward pawn and to chip away at white's centre. If that can happen, then black's probably doing at least equal and pretty well. So game continued, bishop to f4. It's kind of not really got a very good job anywhere on this diagonal, and we can harass it. Knight to d5 protects his pawn, kicks the bishop. Adam continues to try and find a square for it, and I continue to kick it around. But with this manoeuvre, knight is now in a fairly useful place on the queen side, and more importantly it's out of the way of attacking this d4 pawn. So white again is kind of prevented from occupying the full centre for the moment. So e3, modest move, and I'm still in this position of really wanting to play one of these eventually. So my next move is geared towards that, knight d7. However, Adam has now found a way for his bishop to be useful, and finally does get in e4. So this is really critical, kind of Gruenfeld typical position, where white has the centre and black wants to undermine. But it's kind of an interesting one, and this is the second sort of position I wanted to talk about. Because getting in this c5 break is not completely straightforward. The most natural way to do it is just if straight away. I didn't really like the idea that white could just push. And maybe I challenge with this, but computer, funnily enough, actually quite likes this, or thinks it's completely fine for black, but the king feels drafty, this e6 pawn feels weak, and I really didn't like the idea of letting that pawn get that far. So I kind of ruled out the immediate c5 as a way of achieving this break. A computer points out the best way of doing it is simply to play e6 first, and then pretty much whatever white does, let's say knight d2, now c5, works very well, because white never gets a chance to take on e6, and otherwise we're trading on d4 and kind of pretty happy with life. So that's computer's option, but I came up with a admittedly worse, but I thought quite creative at the time, move, which was b4, which on first glance looks like it drops a pawn. Notice white doesn't really have an alternative to this, because c5 will happen anyway, and otherwise black's kind of got away with this move for nothing. So push, and now the point of c5 in this position, where white can't play this because obviously the bishop's attacked, and if we carry on with the forcing line played in the game, white does eventually get this piece back on c5 because the b2 pawn's hanging, and white can't support the bishop with a move like b4. So running through that again, b5, bishop has to take, and now we can play c5 and sack a piece temporarily, and black's managed to demolish the centre. Still some lingering awkwardness. Black's earlier option of e6 first and then c5, as the computer says, makes more sense, but I was pretty pleased with this. We've roughly kind of equalised. Black is actually a pawn down, but we have enough play for it, and this pawn on e4 is falling. Unfortunately, I was running quite short of time and did not play the rest of this game very well. And though I think we should have enough play between kind of a square for our knight and files for our major pieces, this is not the way to go about it, because Adam spotted a nice tactic here. My queen can't hang on to the knight, and I've dropped piece and lost. So that was round 2. Adam now was on 2 out of 2 of the 3-round tournament, sort of heavily favourite to win. We'll just kind of quickly have a look at his last round game against DavidLondon, who came second eventually, because this was quite an interesting one. This one was a Caro, where via an unusual move order at least. I would recommend, if you want to play this sort of exchange Caro, it's slightly better to play in this move order and not commit the knight to knight f3 so early. The problem with this is black gets this bishop g4 move in. Black's main problem in the Caro exchange is it's hard to find a useful square for this bishop, and playing knight f3 straight away solves that problem immediately. Whereas you can be a little bit more coy, sort of play your bishops out and just keep black guessing a little bit. It's still obviously fine for black, but this is the way to make black work for it. So slight diversion there. Back to the game. Knight f3 was played. Black does get in bishop g4, and we get to a sort of very typical Carlsbad type pawn structure where white has a half open E file, black has a half open C file, and both sides sort of don't really want to make a pawn break in the center because it will leave them with an isolated pawn, and you can get play on both sides of the board. This one got really sharp because black sacked a pawn. White then castled queenside, having advanced all the kingside pawns, and we have this asymmetrical pawn race where it looks like black's king should be a little bit weak, but Adam came up with this really nice plan of just sitting it on g7, and the double pawns around black's king are actually really solid. It's hard for white to break this down. If h5 at any point, g4, and the position's very, very closed. Similarly, if g5, f5, things remain closed. So black's a pawn down, but has some play. As played in the game, we got into an endgame, and black found another nice resource here of f5 at this critical moment, sort of forcing the pawns to get traded in a kind of favourable way for black, and ending up in an endgame where this pawn's not really going to survive. So a few more moves, but it's now 4 versus 4, roughly level-ish, but unfortunately David makes a mistake and loses this pawn while controlling that square. So Adam did take away the round 3 win and won the whole thing overall. Final game I want to talk about was my round 3. So I can't win anymore, but had a game against Nev Chess, another regular on these Thursday evening tournaments. Again, I started one knight f3, and we got a slightly different sequence of moves to arrive in what you could get from a d4 type move order. A Chigorin defense where black, instead of getting in this e5 break quite early, instead just carried on developing as if it was a Queen's Gambit declined. And this is a really awkward piece. This knight you don't really want on knight c6, blocking your c-pawn. You'd much rather be able to play c6 or c5 at some point as black, and this is a minor inconvenience, but nonetheless enough that white should be pretty happy with how things worked out. So middle game continues, don't really have too much to talk about here. Black played reasonably well, but he just has problems to solve, and the only way to get some activity for the pieces he felt was to c6 and g5. So game progresses. I get a reasonably nice position around here because basically too many targets. Things fell apart tactically for black. And now here was where this big swing in the evaluation chart happened. My initial intention was to take the bishop on a6, and then I realized, oh, hang on a second, there's counterplay here with the c3 check. What if I take and trade queens on c8 first and then win the bishop? Unfortunately, there's a tactical problem with this, which after my pre-move spectacularly black-fired, and now instead of being a piece up, I'm a piece down. Oops. So the nature of the game has changed quite a lot now. Black should be winning, has a piece for 2 pawns, and when you're in these kind of winning positions, the first thing you want to do is just keep control. Don't trade too many pawns, don't give white counterplay, and eventually there are too many weaknesses. White's pawns are going to start dropping if you can just stop white from stir up any funny business. And conversely, on my side, I just want to generate counterplay, stay active, try not to drop that many pawns and trade as many as I can. Okay, but with the parameters of this endgame established, let's look at where we get. Around here. So I managed to trade all of the pawns except one. The rooks have come off and there's a bishop left. And how do we evaluate this position? Because this pawn is quite close to queening, but white's king is quite near enough to stop it. And then white has these 3 pawns charging towards the queening square over here. And black's problem is how do you keep these in check, or how do you force through this? And it's really not easy to do. So in the game, obviously c4 stops black picking up another pawn for free. We reach here, which I think is critical. And what black decides to do is to run the king over here to blockade these pawns, and then defend this pawn, this far advanced pawn with the bishop. And we get a sort of blockade like this. White can't really make any progress, but has enough counterplay with these pawns because these are so far apart. The king can't really deal with both. Eventually, the bishop's going to have to get involved and take a pawn, and white will be able to get in and pick up this one, which is why the computer thinks it's dead level for the whole way. And yeah, king needs to be over here to stop this guy, so I can deflect the bishop away from this diagonal and pick up this final pawn. Pretty tricky ending. However, even though with the sort of cursory analysis, Lichess does think this is drawn, there's a really nice feature on Lichess, which is 7-man endgame table bases, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pieces on the board. So a table exists which will tell you whether any given position is lost, won, or drawn. And the slightly extraordinary thing is that black, with an alternative plan, can win this, though it's very non-obvious. And it's in this position. Instead of advancing the pawn, which feels like the most natural thing in the world, bishop c2. Now, on the face of it, this looks ridiculous, but first tactical point, white can't take the bishop because otherwise the king can no longer stop the pawn, so it's immune. Okay, but what's the point? Well, the point is this black king can't stop all of the pawns, but black can force an arrangement where this bishop can actually control all these pawns. For example, let's say the white king runs towards this pawn. Black's king can now support this one while bishop is handling these pawns. Let's say here. White's king has firmly blockaded this pawn. Now white provokes these pawns onto the dark squares. Notice this one can't advance past this diagonal, which is where we're going to be blockading the pawns. Say something like this, and now just bishop a4. None of the white pawns can get past this bishop, they're completely blockaded. And eventually, black's going to start running out of moves. Oh, sorry, white's going to start running out of moves. Black can wait, and now the king has to move back. Black's king can come in, let's say here, and these are completely blockaded, which means black has all the time in the world to force through his pawn. Black's just in a winning position now with white in Zugzwang. So really interesting endgame. Kind of extraordinary that that exists here, and interesting that a computer quick analysis without the table base misses it completely. So yeah, table base is a useful tool. Anyway, that kind of rounds off my recap of Metropolitan Chess Club online tournament number 31. I hope that was interesting, and there are a few points which you hadn't seen before. Let me know and I might do more. So thanks for watching.